Hey everybody, FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos here, and as I mentioned on my blog a few days ago, my blog, by the way, for those of you who don't know, is at thechessmind.net. So anyway, as I mentioned there in discussing the Gibraltar tournament, which is just finishing today, I was very much taken by the game played between Artur Yusupov, the former candidate, many-time candidate, and Alexei Shirov. So two great players. Yusupov still a very strong grandmaster, though certainly not playing at his prime any longer, but still a great player, and also a very fine author as well. And of course, Alexei Shirov, we've all known for many years, Mr. Fire on Board, tremendous tactician, as we'll see in this game. And Yusupov's not so bad himself. So this was played in round 8. It was a 10-round event, and well, we'll see. It's really quite an extraordinary battle. So Yusupov had white, and Shirov won the game, which is why we're looking at it upside down. And here Shirov played a well-known little finesse with castles. And the idea is to wait and see what white does with his e-pawn before black in turn commits with his d-pawn. So on e3, for example, you can play d6 and then go for kind of a King's Indian type approach. See, the thing is, white is trying to be a little bit coy with the pawn structure. White essentially wants to keep a structure where there isn't a great deal of pawn tension. So white's got a little more space and would like to slowly torture black if possible. And black, for his part, generally wants to have a little bit of juice in the position, a little bit of pawn tension. So e3 is met by d6, so you can play e5 or c5, something to start grabbing at the white center. On the other hand, if white plays e4, well, now you can play d5, and this is actually very good. If e5, knight to e4, no problem. So that's the idea, but Yusupov decides to outlast him, so he plays c3, and now if d6, then white plays e4, and you get kind of a Pearce setup, and on d5, which is what Shirov played, then white plays e3, and keeps the fixed structure. Alright, Shirov plays knight b to d7, bishop to d3, and here there are a number of ways to go. Shirov went for a plan involving a quick e5, and he notes that queen to e8 is not so great because white can play bishop to f4, stopping e5, hitting the c-pawn, and if black plays something like c6, white has time for h3 to preserve the bishop against any knight h5 ideas. So white's probably a little bit better there. An alternative plan that I often like with black in such situations is to play c5, b6, fianchetto, play the knight to e4, put rooks on c8 and e8, and play for e5. So it's kind of long-winded, but it's often a very effective plan. So castles, b6, and then here I think white's best is probably b4. For once, white is going to be the one initiating a little bit of tension. And now black has to decide between just kind of standing pat with bishop to b7 or fixing this queenside structure with c4. Now you've got to be careful about a move like c4. You can play c4 if you're sure that white can't get e4 in, or at least can't get it in under favorable circumstances. But if you can, then the problem with c4 is that it takes all of the pressure off of white's d-pawn, and then he's much more solid and has better attacking chances. And additionally, the c4 pawn could be weak after e4, d takes e4. You could play e6 in response to e4, but then that's kind of passive, so you don't really want to do that if you can avoid it. Alright, and then a third approach for black is to play a5 and just ramp the tension up a notch. Alright, all of this is possible, but Shirov went for a simpler plan, or let's say a more speedy plan with rook to e8. So he wants to be a direct plan, so he wants to just play e5 straight away. So Yusupov castled, Shirov played e5, and now e4. And I think Shirov was already out of his theoretical knowledge at this point. Yusupov plays this kind of stuff pretty regularly, and other people have played it too, but it's obviously not a main thoroughfare of opening theory, but at least a very interesting play, as we'll see. Alright, at this point, it might be safer for black to play h6, and I think Shirov mentions this in his little video presentation. So takes, ed5, ed4, knight takes, and knight to b6. And this looks perfectly good for black. I don't know that Shirov gave this entire line or not, but I think he mentions h6, and that's fine. But he played e takes d4, takes, knight e4, h6. And he just expected some exchanges to take place, and then black should be fine. I mean, he's essentially got a pretty respectable anti-isolated pawn position. But he was in for a surprise, was Mr. Shirov. Yusupov played queen to b3. And this is a brilliant move. It wasn't new, though. It actually had been played, not in a lot of games, but in 5 games going back to 2010, and also by some pretty good players, including, for instance, the very strong French Grandmaster Bauer, who played it against Smirin. Also, Suneberg Hansen played it. Then the old German international master Werner Hug played it. So it has had a few little tryouts, but again, I mean, not quite at the super grandmaster level, though Bauer Smirin is pretty high level. Anyway, this was a real shock for Shirov, and he had to spend 50 minutes trying to figure out what in the world to do here. Okay, so the obvious question, of course, is, well, what do you do about the bishop? Well, as a matter of fact, it doesn't really seem to be that bad. After hg, I think knight e takes g5 is best. And now, okay, black has to be careful. If he plays queen to e7, he gets just obliterated. Bishop takes g6, rook f8, rook a to e8, e1, queen d6, takes here, and now just one nightmare after another. Knight h4. Okay, threatening knight to g6 mate, knight to g6 check, knight to e6 check, and the variations are all kind of amusing, but not for black. So, for instance, if he takes, then we take this guy, check, and all right, something like this, and white's just winning. I mean, white's up material, so white's got a queen and 3 pawns for the 3 minor pieces, but the black king is still in trouble. Black's queen side is sleeping, so white's winning. Alternatively, king h7, and now knight e7. More fun. Among the ideas is to play queen d3, check, and then queen to g6. Alright, if rook f7, then knight g5 check, and then it's mate, next move, king h8, knight g6, or king h6, queen g6. Or we should give the knight his props here. Knight f5 mate. Alright, so let's let him have the honors either way. Okay, so that's rook f7. If queen takes e7, then just check, and you pick up the queen. And again, it's queen and 3 pawns versus 3 minor pieces with, once again, black's king still in some trouble, and the black queen side fast asleep. Okay, finally, if king h8, then knight f5, forking the queen and the bishop, and white has 3 extra pawns and an ongoing attack. Even after the trade of queens, black's king is still not really completely safe here. Okay, so that is a little bit of what kinds of horrors can befall black in case he plays queen to e7 or something along those lines. So the right move is knight to f8. And surprisingly, white doesn't seem to have anything really by way of a knockout blow here. So he's got a couple of lines that offer some advantage, but nothing quite earth-shattering. So for instance, the obvious queen f7, king h8, and now probably best is just to back right back out. Queen to b3, bishop e6, stopping knight f7, takes, knight e5, threatening knight f7 all over again, king g8, bishop g6, okay, rook e7 is forced, check, and in this position, white has a rook and 3 pawns for 2 minor pieces, but the rooks, it's going to take them a while to really get into their own, and the 3 kingside passers are at least still starting back home. So if black can somehow get the bishop to d4, if he can win that pawn, and then he would have some real counterplay. And maybe he can't win the pawn, but he can at least try to tie white down to it. The knight can get active. Anyway, it looks like this is still a lot of work for white, and maybe he's only a bit better here. Not even close to winning. Okay, so that was queen f7. Alternatively, you can try bishop takes g6. Bishop e6, takes here, and now rook a to c1. And here, black has some serious problems with his queen side. Note that rook e7 doesn't really do anything because rook takes f7, knight f7 wins an exchange, and then black ends up losing the c-pawn anyway. So knight to d5 is probably best. Rook c5, c6, and now white picks up a couple of pawns. And we have a funny position where this time the screwy material imbalance is white having 5 pawns for the bishop. Well, the pawns again are still all the way back home over there on the king side. In fact, all of them except for the d pawn are still back at home. And after rook to e2, black's even got some counterplay. So white's advantage still seems to be fairly minimal at this point. So h takes g5 really may not be that bad. It's kind of scary to play like this, but it might be okay. All right. In an earlier game, I should say, black tried rook to e6, and Shirov spent time thinking about this. Bishop h4, g5, and now, okay, a couple of possibilities here. So Shirov reported looking at knight f6, bishop to g3, and this I think is kind of unclear. After knight h5, white could play either bishop c4, getting back to his fun on the diagonal, just rook a to d1, taking care of the d4 pawn, and developing, and also bishop to e5, aiming to either preserve his dark squared bishop against the knight, or at least to force some more weaknesses in black's position. In the earlier game between Bauer and Smirin, white sacrificed a piece, like so. And after knight to b6, bishop g6 was a very nice move, and now white was clearly better and went on to win in impressive style. But the right move here is knight to f8, and again this position is kind of unclear. So it does seem that rook to e6 is also playable in addition to the move that Shirov chose. So Shirov played rook to e7. This was his way of dealing with the position. And this in turn came as a surprise to Yusupov. So Yusupov, I'm sure, was familiar with the rook to e6 games, but apparently he wasn't really as well prepared as he could have been either. And now he thought for an hour and 12 minutes on this crazy position. All right, now it turns out that there was a game, as I said. I'm not sure if it was played before or after this. I mean, it's the year is young. So in a tournament in Queenstown here in 2012, Suneberg Hansen against Zhao Jun went like this. So here it was rook f to e1. So he kept the sacrifice going. H takes g5, knight e takes g5, knight f8, knight f7, rook f7, bishop c4. White's down 2 pieces for 2 pawns, but of course he's getting something back. Bishop e6, and now rook takes e6. And here it looks as if white is really in business. I mean, if knight e6, bishop e6, and then on, for instance, queen e7, you can play knight to d5, or knight to e5 or g5, and white even ends up ahead in material. But black had a key resource here, b5. So this saves his hide here. After queen takes b5, black could either try rook to b8, and the position is unclear, I think, or knight takes e6. This is what happened in the game. Bishop e6, queen e8, queen b3, and now just in time, king f8. And here the position is, again, kind of unclear. So white has 3 pawns for the piece, stands reasonably well. Black's pawns are kind of weak, but again, white's 3 pawns really don't look like 3 pawns. There's no passers out of the whole lot of them. So I think black is fine. Anyway, the game ended up as a draw many moves later in another 53 moves. Okay, so instead of rook f to e1, Yusupov found another fantastic move. So knight to e5. So another brilliant shot, and I think Shirov said he had to think for another 27 minutes here, trying to come up with a good answer. Now, there was an earlier game between Werner Hug and Onion Chivitan. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. He's a former world junior champion, but he hasn't been playing very much the last few years. So in that game in Switzerland in 2010, Chivitan played knight takes e5, which is a bit inaccurate. So knight takes f6 check. Okay, here if bishop takes f6, then bishop f6, queen d4, bishop e7, knight d3, rook a to d1, bishop f5, and queen takes b7. And actually Shirov pointed out this variation after the game, noting that black's compensation is insufficient. And he's right. It's just basically down in exchange. The knight on d3 is great, but it's not enough by itself. Okay, so instead of bishop takes f6, though, in the Hugh game, Chivitan played king h8, and after d takes e5, h takes g5. Here, white should have played rook a to e1 instead of queen to c3. Hugh won anyway, but this looks like the best move, aiming to get some rook lift action as fast as possible, and of course just protecting the pawn on e5. The white's clearly better here. So Shirov was right to reject knight takes e5, and instead he played h takes g5. So here we have a new move. Now the point of this is not going to be evident just yet. So Yusupov makes another very good move. Knight takes f7. And Okay, what should black do here? So this whole thing is just crazy. And both players, I have to say, one of the things that makes this game so amazing is not just how complicated it is, but how incredibly well both players played in this game. I mean, really remarkable chess. All right, so here, if rook takes f7, then knight takes g5 is big trouble. If you play queen f8, you can just take, and queen f7, bishop c4, so you can't do that. So it looks like white is winning material. Well, in fact, he is winning material. Knight e5 takes, knight to d5. So this is an attempt to kind of save black a little bit, but he's still under serious pressure here. Okay, if c6, which looks like the right move, e6 check is also strong. Now, if bishop takes e6, or king takes e6, bishop takes g6, and the black king is kind of, well, he's a little too well centralized. Let's just put it that way. So bishop e6 is better, but now white gets to break this central structure that black has, and with the rook and 3 pawns and an initiative for the 2 minor pieces, white is in fact winning at this point. So Yusupov was no doubt happy about that, but Shirov had prepared a fantastic move at this point. Knight to c5. Wow. So, you know, white can take the knight both ways. He can take on d8. All kinds of stuff is possible. He can play knight f6 check. I mean, this is just a headache of a position. I mean, really fantastic stuff. All right. Well, white has 3 moves to choose from. Okay, knight takes d8 is not very good because of knight b3, of course. But all the other moves, well, and the problem with that is that the knight on d8 is going to be stranded, and so black will eventually emerge a piece ahead. But dc5, knight c5, and knight f6 check are all not only worthy of considering, but are all actually okay moves. All right, let's start. Let's start with d takes c5. So here, if you try bishop to e6, this would be a mistake because queen e6, rook e6, knight d8, rook d8, and then knight takes g5. And after rook e5, if you try that, for instance, to hit both of white's minor pieces, then bishop c4 check. And that's even worse for black because then knight f7 comes next. So, or at least comes next in case of the king moving. All right, so that's no good. So after d takes c5, black should play rook takes f7. Now knight takes g5, queen d5. And on bishop c4, there's queen takes g5. Well, we'll look at all the options. So white's got 3 tries here. Taking is probably the least impressive. Here, black is a little bit better. So white's got a rook and 2 pawns for the bishop and knight. It's a good material balance, but the knight on d5 is great. The bishop on g7 is hitting b2. And once again, this 3-on-1 on the king side is really pretty effective for black. I mean, it's difficult, and it's going to take white quite a while to make a passed pawn. The pawns aren't playing a role anytime soon, and meanwhile, black's minor pieces are looking like they're going to be quite active quite quickly. Okay, instead of queen takes d5, probably a better try is bishop c4. But here too, you know, black is okay. Black is not really hurting at this point either. I would probably prefer black, practically speaking. And then finally, there's knight takes f7. And again, black is quite okay here. But objectively, it's probably about equal. Anyway, what is clear is that dc doesn't really give white anything concrete. Okay, let's look at knight takes c5. So here, rook f7, and now white can choose between bishop c4 and bishop takes g6. If bishop c4, then queen f8, and knight takes b7. So this was the idea, and there's no danger with rook to b8 because white trades twice, and then plays knight to d8, and then bounces out to c6. Okay, black can play rook takes b2, but then the rook goes to b1, and that trades off the rooks, and there's also threats of rook to b8. So that would actually be pretty good for white. Black is much better served keeping his rook on the board. And by the way, kind of an interesting rule of thumb that I learned some years ago is that when you've got these kinds of material imbalances, so here, for instance, white has a rook and 2 pawns for 2 bishops, it's often best to keep as many different kinds of pieces on the board as you can. So in other words, it wouldn't be so bad for white to trade off a pair of rooks because he's still got a rook. But for black to trade off a pair of rooks would be because then he doesn't have a rook. He does not have a rook. So he loses some of the possible synergy that he gets by having various sorts of pieces. So rook to b6 would be best, and after rook a to c1, knight to d5, and this position appears to be about equal once again. All right, back here. The other try, of course, is bishop takes g6. queen d5, takes, and now queen g3. And again, the position is kind of unclear. So if black could finish his development, then he would probably be better. But for the moment, at least, he's got to still deal with threats, and the white rooks have chances to jump onto the e-file quickly. So this position, I think, really is messy. I don't think it's on the verge of being better for black. All right, so knight c5 is definitely worth considering. Yusupov played knight f6 check, bishop f6, and then dc. Okay, rook f7, bishop takes g6, queen f8. And here Shirov mentioned as an interesting idea c6, just because this pawn will often be lost anyway, and maybe it's worth trying to create some damage in the black structure. Maybe not. Maybe black can play bc and at some point play rook to b8, and that'll help him to finish his development. So it's not really clear that this is best. But I think Yusupov's move is very good. So he plays f4, and suddenly it's clear that the initiative has not yet disappeared. I mean, both sides are really fighting hard for the to take over the initiative. So white is still down a piece for 2 pawns, but of course he can always cash in on f7, and he's trying to keep his pieces alive. I mean, once it becomes a battle between the rook and 2 pawns versus the bishops, you got to put your money on the bishops unless the rooks are very, very active, or the pawns are very meaningful. I mean, again, bishops are just such tremendous pieces in an open board, and that's what we've got here. So white has to really keep the flames of the attack burning. All right, well, Shirov rightly plays g4, keeping the f-file closed, and now Yusupov plays f5, and this is very, very good. So it prevents any ideas by black to play bishop e6 later on to try to plug up the diagonal. It also, in general, keeps the bishop on c8 passive. It overprotects the bishop on g6, and it prepares rook f4, followed by rook takes g4. So it's still really an amazingly pitched battle at this point. All right, well now Shirov makes another good move. He plays bishop to d7. Okay, not grabbing the c5 pawn. And we won't look at it here, but we'll look at it next move and see why taking on c5 is probably not the most brilliant idea in the world for black, at least not yet. All right. Now here, white could play not only rook to f4, which is what happens, but bishop takes f7. So let's see how this one works. And the idea is to grab on b7. So now white's got a rook and 3 pawns for the bishop here, but still black is doing quite well. And Shirov gives a line really impressive. I mean, again, it's hard for me to express my admiration for just how incredibly well both of these guys played. I mean, they made moves that the computer likes for just move after move after move in just such a berserk position. So Shirov gives the following line, which is quite good. So rook to e8, queen c7, bishop to d4 check, king h1, and now bishop to e5. And yeah, this was a variation Shirov gives. And you can see black is getting all of his pieces into attacking positions. And the fact that white has a rook and 4 pawns for the 2 bishops really doesn't matter because, well, he's in trouble. He's got to play very accurately here. In fact, queen to b7 is the only move at this point. Okay, queen h7, threatening mate, g3. And now, remarkably, black can play bishop to a4. So maybe a knight on the rim is dim, but the bishop on a4 is okay. The idea is simply to force a trade of queens, and then after it takes and takes, bishop to c6 mating is threatened. So rook f to e1 is just about forced. Bishop c6, king g1, bishop d4, king f1, rook f8. Okay, check here. Let's say rook to d1. And this position can only favor black. I mean, these bishops are rapacious. Yeah, I mean, this is not easy for white. I mean, white's maybe still alive, but it's difficult. All right. However, going back to here, instead of queen takes c7, when, again, it was check, and here with tremendous play for black, maybe white is better off with rook to f4, stopping bishop to d4 check, and, of course, threatening to collect the pawn on g4. Black's best here is, I think, bishop to g5, rook g4, and then queen f5. So here, black closes the material gap, but now white is okay. The rook on g3 is, of course, very well posted, and the black king is looking a bit airy over here. So I think both sides are all right at this point. So this probably would have been white's best bet, at least with bishop takes f7. So in the game, Yusupov played rook to f4, keeping the tension with the pin alive. All right. So I promised that we would look at queen takes c5 here and see just why this is so bad. So king h1, and now we've got to come back and do something about the threat to play queen f7 check and then queen h7 mate. Okay, rook a to f8 is one idea, but now rook takes g4, threatening bishop takes f7, which is a double check and would win the rook outright. So let's suppose bishop to g7, but now queen h3, and this is just becoming a disaster for black, and black is losing at this point. All right, instead of rook a to f8, maybe black could try queen to f8. Now rook to d1, threatening the bishop. Rook e8, little trick there because of the back rank mate. After rook takes d7, rook e1, and then rook f1. So rook takes g4, again threatening bishop f7, bishop to g7, and now white cashes in. You just take everything. Okay, well we don't take on g7 because of rook e1 mate, but simply king to g1, and white is up the exchange and 2 pawns with a better position. So this would be game over. So that's why queen takes c5 check is bad. It's for the benefit of gaining a relatively insignificant pawn. Black is giving away 2 tempi in a position where tempi matter a great deal. Okay, another move that's not so good is king to g7. The aim of getting out of this frustrating pin is a good one, but after rook takes g4, the black king is too exposed, and again bishop takes f7 check is a threat that picks up a full rook. So black is completely lost here as well. So Shirov found the right move here. Bishop to c6. And now queen takes c5 check is a threat because black can follow up immediately with bishop to d5, finally plugging up that incredibly annoying diagonal, that pin that's been just torturing black for move after move here. So now the tide is starting to turn here. White has to find some good idea to not let black just kill the pin and take over the initiative. Okay, so we can look at a bunch of moves here. Now one idea is just to play rook to c1. Let's protect the pawn. And no pawn on, or no queen on c5. There's no bishop on d5 as a follow-up. But here queen at e7 looks pretty good. And this prepares, after rook takes g4, to play king f8. And so finally the pin is broken, and black is okay here. So again, white's got a rook and 3 pawns for the 2 bishops. Probably this is about equal at this point. Though again, I'm always more fearful for the side with the rook. The bishops are looking fairly hungry. Okay, so that's rook c1. If you play rook takes g4, just getting on with your business, well, we'll see that this is quite strong. And the fact that the king is looking slightly exposed, well, it's really not that exposed. And if white plays queen h3, black has rook h8. So there's really nothing left of white's kingside attacking prospects, and probably black is winning even already at this point. Okay, another idea is to play rook to d1, and this stops bishop to d5. So if queen takes c5 check, king h1, there's no bishop to d5, and the queen has to scurry back, let's say to e7. Now rook takes g4, king f8, takes, and now queen a3 check, and the material balance isn't so bad for black. Again, it's a rook and 2 pawns for the 2 bishops, but here black's king has not really managed to achieve complete safety just yet, so white still has some initiative. This line I think is from Golubev in Chess Today. Alright, okay, so back here. So after rook to d1, instead of taking on c5, it's probably better to play rook to e8. And now after queen to c4, protecting the pawn, rook e5, b4, it seems to me that the play still continues to be interesting, but black has at least not managed to fully consolidate, and white still has prospects. So this line may not be so bad. Alright, another line is just to collect here, bishop f7, and then rook g4. And Shirov mentions this variation. So queen h3, rook e8, rook d1, rook e2, check, here. And surprisingly, the king is actually pretty safe here in the middle of the board. And after h4, bishop e5. It's a weird position, but black seems to be okay. Seems to be equal. And this was, again, a variation Shirov produced, talking about the game afterwards. Okay, and then finally, let's look at the game move. And this might be a mistake, king h1. So the computer is not unhappy with white's position just yet. It still thinks it's about equal, but I think this probably is, at this point I think black starts to take over. So Shirov played rook to d8, and he said at this point that he felt like he shouldn't lose the game any longer. And I think that's right. I mean, because now he finally gets to play bishop to d5, kill that diagonal, and he should be okay. So Yusupov took on g4, bishop to d5. Okay, white could cash in and play queen h3, but similar to the line that I showed you earlier, black plays queen h8, and this takes over enough squares. And black is all right here. Even though white has a rook and 3 pawns for the 2 pieces, again, the bishops are majestic. And the white rooks really have no entry points. I mean, that's kind of the key thing. White rooks have no entry points. The black or the white kingside pawns are not advancing. So, you know, all this material, but if you can't do anything with it, who cares? All right, so Yusupov played queen h3, allowing white to keep the rook. But the bishop on g6 is still a very good attacking piece, and he probably felt that, you know, maybe he expected that there would be a draw by repetition with bishop h7 check, king f7, bishop g6, king g8, and so on. Okay, well, we'll come back to that in a moment. I'll just point out that if rook to e1, trying to cut off the black king from escaping, in other words, bishop h7, king f7, bishop g6, there's no king e7 now. Well, here, black can play queen takes c5. And now with bishop h7, simply king f8. So we've got another flight square. So rook e1's no good. So back to the game. Bishop check, king f7, bishop g6. And Shirov just fought boldly on with king to e7. And here he thought that he was actually in great shape. And he is in good shape, but he missed Yusupov's next move, queen a3. So another very strong move. And all of a sudden, we see that the attack still isn't over. That white can still generate quite a lot of play here. All right, Shirov gets out of the way with king to d7. And now, okay, if white grabs the a7 pawn, trying to kind of preemptively prevent black from castling queenside, so to speak, then rook a8 is annoying. White's forced to play c6 check. But after b takes c6, the black king is completely safe. And although material is nominally even, with white having 3 pawns for the bishop, the position is not. In fact, black is winning here. All right. So in the game, rook to d1, bringing the last piece into play, king c8, and black has castled both ways in this game. Earlier, of course, he castled the normal way. This time, he castled manually. All right, well, what can white do here? Well, now he can play queen a7 because there's no rook to a8. All right, Shirov plays c6, which is forced. His king needs flight squares over on that side of the board, too, and this protects the d5 bishop, and it also produces a lateral defense here of the pawn on b7. So there are quite a few things that this move does that's pretty good. Okay, queen a8 check. So it's funny, before he was trying for perpetual on the king side, here he's trying to drum up a perpetual over on the queen side, but of course Shirov is still playing for the win. And now rook a4. So it still looks kind of scary, but at least in black's favor, especially after this fine move bishop to e5, is that these bishops are just tremendous pillars of strength, as we've seen over and over again. While meanwhile, the white bishop on g6 is no longer really participating anymore. Although, to be fair, it's not really clear where it could participate. I mean, what light square can we put this bishop on where it does anything? I guess e6 because of the temporary pin on the d file, but that aside, I mean, it's just got nothing to do. All right, further, the bishop on e5 aims at h2, so now the black counterattack is on the verge of starting, while it can also help to defend on the queen side. Okay, Yusupov played h3, giving himself a flight square against any back rank worries, and also eliminating any threats to play bishop takes h2. Now here, and this would have been, oh, what a terribly anticlimactic finish this would have been. Shirov almost played bishop to c7, thinking that this was going to solidify his queen side, but of course that would end the game with a solid thud with queen to a8 mate. So fortunately, he saw it in time. So he played the right move, king to c8, and that takes care of all the back rank issues, and now the bishop can block on b8 if necessary. All right, now here, finally, white makes a really severe error, although at this point the game is kind of spinning out of control. Best would have been king to g1, and then after queen to e7, the black queen starts to infiltrate on the dark squares, and while white has 4 pawns for the piece, there's really no comparison in terms of how well posted, or I should say, there's not really any comparison between the piece and those pawns. The white pawns are doing nothing. Black's pieces are very clearly completely into the action here. Alright, so in the game though, white played rook to e1. And it makes sense, but there's a tactical problem here. White is losing now after bishop takes g2 check. So clearly Yusupov missed this move. He was in serious time trouble, understandably. I mean, both these guys had to calculate so many variations. But now, anyway, it's all of a sudden white's king that collapses. So after the black king is running all over creation, it seems, and only now finds its way to safety, although, again, almost blundering into mate in 1 2 moves ago. The black king is safe, but now white's king is about to perish. If he plays king to g1, then black has the rather stylish bishop to e4, leaving the bishop and pre two different ways, but the key is that black will next play queen takes f5, and after rook takes g6, subsequent to that, the white king collapses. Well, let's take a quick look. Let's see if we can prove this. So rook a to e4, queen f5, rook e5. I mean, he's losing the g6 bishop anyway, so we might as well grab that. Rook g6 check. Okay, if king h1, of course, queen h3 is mate, but king h2 is not really any better unless you get points for avoiding mate for one extra move. Alright, so yeah, bishop to e4 finishes the job. Okay, so after bishop g2, Yusupov played king takes g2, and now queen takes f5 is big crunch, and the rest is really just trivial. Okay, he plays rook to g4, rook takes g6, and well, what can he do now? Again, the attack is over. Materially, black is doing fine. If rook g6, queen g6, king h1, and well, probably just queen to g3, if nothing else, ought to win. If queen a8 check, then bishop to b8. Yep, that looks pretty convincing. I guess I should show you what I'm looking at. So rook g6, queen takes g6. Yeah, we don't have rook to d2 because of the queen on a5. So I think we just have to do this. Okay, if the king goes to the f file, then black's rook will come to the f file with, I'm sure, a very quick mate. Maybe queen g3 is even better, depending on where it goes. So king h1, queen g3, and all right. Queen d2 is impossible because of the rook on d8. Rook e2 is impossible because of rook to d1. Well, sorry, rook e1. Well, it doesn't even matter. Might as well just not give anything. I mean, obviously that finishes the job. And on, well, what else is there? Queen check. So I already mentioned this. And now bishop to b8. And that does it. So that wins the queen for nothing, because rook to e2, again, rook to d1 is mating. Alright, so rook takes g6 does not save white at all. So he tried queen to b4. But now, yeah, sort of jokingly, this is the only mistake made by black in the entire game. And it's not really a mistake. So rook to f8 mates in at most 5 more moves, but Shirov finished with the elegant rook to d4. And while maybe there's no forced mate here, at least in the immediate future, this just completely destroys white's defense, and Yusupov resigned here. So, as I said, really a fantastic game by both players. The only kind of serious mistake that was made that I can tell was rook to e1, but again, already at this point, white's in some trouble anyhow. King h1, maybe, earlier in the game. Let me see, where was that? Yeah, so maybe this is the losing move, or virtually the losing move, I'm not sure. But, I mean, it's just a tough position to play, and it's really not clear. I mean, you have to essentially assess these complicated lines where white has a rook and some pawns for the bishop pair, and whether he can maintain enough activity. But what a tremendous game. So both players finding just tremendous resources. You know, Yusupov maybe had a little bit of a jump in preparation, but not much of one. I mean, queen to b3, he had prepared this, but after rook to e7, he was out of his prep. So really both players had to just display incredible ingenuity throughout the game, and succeeded in doing so. I mean, really, really very impressive. A beautiful game, and a model of just incredible defense by Alexei Shirov. So I sure hope you guys liked the game. I'm certainly, obviously, very enthusiastic about it. And, you know, and it's a nice little trap, too. I mean, I don't think you're going to find too many opponents who are going to play this as well as Shirov did. So this might be a nice little trap for those of you guys who like to play the Tory attack. All right, well, that'll do it. Hope you enjoyed this. We'll get back to our series on the Ruy Lopez soon, but I wanted to take a week off from it, and I think this game was very much well worth it. See you later. Bye-bye.